Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 362. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to help support and inspire new trauma workers through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. Thanks so much for joining me today, and here we go. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Michael Salter. Michael, welcome.
Hi, Guy. It's great to be with you.
All right. Michael Salter is an associate professor in criminology at Western Sydney University, Australia, and specializes in the study of organized sexual abuse. In addition to his work on complex trauma, he has researched and published widely on violence against women and children. Michael sits on the Scientific Advisory Committee and the Board of Directors of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and he's an associate editor of Child Abuse Review, the peer-reviewed journal of the British Association for the Study and Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. All right, Michael, let's kind of step back here a minute and just share with our listeners where you're from and where you're calling from, and then let's do it.
Yes, I'm currently calling from Sydney, Australia, and I'm based at Western Sydney University here.
Okay. And are you originally from there?
I'm Australian born and bred.
Okay, nice. So just reading your bio, I mean, it's serious. I mean, it's heavy, and we're gonna get into how you got there. But let's start off with, as we usually do, with a quote, a sentence, a mantra, something kind of set the tone here. What do you have for us?
Well, a quote that I first read when I started doing trauma work, and it's always stayed with me, comes from Marsha Linehan, who, of course, is famous for her work in dialectic behavioral therapy. And, she talks about the role of trauma therapy and recovery in building a life worth living. And that concept of a life worth living has just always stayed with me as a guide in terms of what we're trying to secure for survivors, and what we're trying to offer to survivors is the opportunity to find for themselves a life that they want to live in. And it's a quote that I've often been able to share with survivors, and it really connects with them in a beautiful way, I think.
So let's kind of unpack that via you kind of describing your story and how you got to this place. And kind of let's dial in and take us step by step, if you can, here. I suppose my journey is a little unorthodox. I first came across the issue of trauma and dissociation in my late teens. A close friend of mine, a young woman, began to disclose a pretty serious history of child sexual abuse by a group of men in the town where we grew up. And at the time, we were sharing a house. We were flatmates going to university together. And so I witnessed firsthand what severe complex trauma looks like. She struggled to eat. She had flashbacks. Her mood was incredibly variable, and she would become very depressed, and all of the common symptoms of severe trauma. And we spent a period of time trying to find support for her, services that could help, and it was incredibly difficult. And over a period of time, I came to realize that something had to be done. Mm-hmm. My background was in research, was in academic research and public policy. So I made a career change, and a decision to specialize in the needs of this group of people, so adult survivors of organized child sexual abuse. So excuse me, Michael, let me just kind of jump in here. So you said you were both at university. How old were you at this, like in your 20s?
19.
19, okay. So yeah. This is a flatmate of yours. She comes to you and shares this to you. And what was your response? I mean, she was a good friend of yours, so you knew her quite well?
Yeah. I knew her fairly well. She didn't really have the ability to disclose much because she was really overwhelmed by trauma symptoms. Constant flashbacks and so on. So it was pretty apparent just from her behaviour that something was wrong. By our early 20s, so it took a couple of years to realise that she was still trapped in a cycle of abuse. She was still being routinely abused.
Oh my God.
By the men that had abused her as a child. And so that certainly triggered a crisis period for both of us, where I worked with her quite intensively to try to secure her safety from this group of men who were pretty dangerous, and they did things like break into the house, and they graffitied the house, and they did all sorts of crazy stuff. But it was a real illustration to me that there was a group of people out there like her who were completely vulnerable, because we were approaching police, we were trying to contact mental health services. I wasn't quiet about this. I was trying to get help for her, and there wasn't anything. So it really drove the point home that if someone was going to do anything about it, it was probably going to be me.
Oh my God. So you got to the point where you, I guess probably quickly got to the point where you were like, what the hell is going on here? And just like you said, I've got to do something about this.
That's a pretty good summary of how it felt at the time. And I was actually working in politics for a couple of years while this was happening. I was a policy advisor to a member of parliament. So there was this really bizarre division in my life where during the day I had a position of some authority, and then at night there was this completely out of control situation where frankly no one took us seriously. I made a decision when I was about 24 or 25 to turn this into a career and move away from politics and public policy back into academic research.
That is, so admirable to do what you did. And what if we can kind of put a magnifying glass on that? What was it in your being, in your soul, that made you take the step to do this as a career? You could see some people maybe wanting to get this person help and doing what they can, but you're like, bam, this is what I've got to do. What was that, or is that in you, do you think?
To be honest, I've got a pretty kind of childlike sense of injustice, and so when I think things are unjust, I just have a primal sense of outrage, and I think it probably was a trauma response from my end as well, a need to try and make sense and make some meaning out of what had happened. She wasn't the only survivor. There was a group of survivors connected to who'd been abused by the same group, and there was at the time an attempted police investigation into this group. That was a very controversial investigation, and the Ombudsman was then called in to investigate the investigation, and then there was an investigation of the investigation of the investigation.
Oh my God.
And it became apparent that there were significant irregularities in the attempt to investigate this group. So it was a situation that I'd been caught up in that had sort of spiraled out of control, and and I do think that the decision to go back to study, to make a career out of this, of course, there was altruistic motivations, but I think also I was in a bit of a state of shock and really keen to understand in more detail what had happened to her, but also what I'd been exposed to as well.
So what happens next? you decide, in terms of your own story here, you decide that you're going to pursue this professionally. What did you do specifically?
I was really aware that there was a lack of evidence around organised child sexual abuse. This was around sort of 2005 to 2006, where the concept of a pedophile ring was actually pretty controversial. And there was a broad view in the media and amongst many academics and psychologists that child sex offenders operated individually, that they didn't operate in groups. And so there was a real need to flesh out this issue with, robust research. So I decided to go back to university and to undertake a PhD and to do a focused bit of work on organised abuse. So I spent 3 years interviewing. In detail, interviewing other survivors of organised child sexual abuse in Australia. So this was quite detailed interview research that formed the basis of my thesis and was then published as a book in 2013.
The name of the book was what?
Organised sexual abuse.
Okay. What were some of your findings? I mean, it's hard not to, listening to you talk, it's hard not to think that, I mean, especially with the Me Too movement, now upon us, and how many people don't want to come out because they're not believed. And here we go again, this same resonance of people not being believed. People don't want to see evidence or hear evidence. So anyway, talk a little bit about your findings, if you would.
The primary finding of the study was the role of families in child sexual exploitation. The majority of the adults that I interviewed described their parents as the primary offenders, who then made them available for sexual abuse to other people. And this was really contrary to the dominant view at the time, which is that if pedophile networks existed, they existed outside the family, they involved offenders in the community or offenders online. And it's been interesting in the time since the book's been published, as law enforcement agencies begin to track down, perpetrators of what's sometimes called child pornography or child abuse images. They are also finding that the majority of offenders are parents and related to the child. So this was a really important finding that has started to have an international effect. The interviews also highlighted the role of quite a controversial form of child sexual abuse known as ritual abuse. Mm-hmm. Probably 2/3 of my participants described some experience of ritualistic abuse as part of their child exploitation. And it really brought to the fore that we have subcultures of abuse and sadism operating in the community that do engage in quite bizarre behaviour. But again, this is being substantiated by law enforcement investigations looking at sadistic abusers. And there are a stratum of child sex offenders who do engage in this type of behaviour.
You mentioned early on when you were trying to advocate and help your friend that you kind of ran up against a lot of disbelief. Can you talk about that? And even now, what is it? Why do we not want to see or believe, or what is going on?
Child sexual abuse reveals the fundamental, hypocrisies of society. We love to believe that we live in a society that cares for children, that looks after children, a society that is, predictable and orderly. And child sexual abuse is incredibly challenging for people. It really upends so many of our assumptions about our fellow human beings. And it's just easier. It is easier to disbelieve than to believe. For somebody that has been severely abused as a child in a premeditated and sadistic way, their needs are, they have a range of needs that are really intense, that are going to need a lot of time, a lot of energy to meet. And we have not arranged our health systems to do that. We have not arranged our criminal justice system in order to prosecute these sorts of offences. And so they just fall outside our established responses to crime and to abuse. And so I do just think it's easier to turn away and to get on with your life. Basically, it's easier. Yeah.
Man. Yeah, and I realize, as when I read your bio initially, and then again to before we jumped on here, I was like, man, this is intense. There's no two ways about it. And I remember when I first got into graduate school, I knew I wanted to focus on trauma, and yet there was a fear I had, Michael, and it was really specifically about this. It was like the fear that I would hear kids sharing their stories, or just the child abuse just freaked me out. And it's so intense. So what are you doing now specifically? What's your role now?
So, of course, I'm based at the university, and my focus is on research. Research into system responses to complex trauma. So, at the moment, I'm leading a national study investigating the ways that different sectors, including mental health, alcohol and drug, child protection, law enforcement, is responding to adults with complex trauma. I also do a lot of direct training and practice work with therapists and mental health practitioners, and also law enforcement, to provide evidence and information about organised child sexual abuse. And in the future, working with law enforcement agencies at the moment, both here in Australia and overseas, to do more survivor-focused research, particularly looking at survivors of what's sometimes called child pornography or child abuse images, to understand not only the context in which child abuse material is being manufactured, but what are the outcomes for survivors? How are they falling through the cracks? How can we improve our support for adults who have this kind of history?
Mm-hmm. When you talk about, improving the systematic response for care for these individuals, it almost feels as though that's going to be born out of an improvement in people's individual responses and feelings and beliefs, right? One is a logistic response, but we've been talking about how people just find it very difficult even thinking and talking and believing this. What shifts need to be made?
Look, my assumption, the more work that I do with professionals across a range of sectors in complex trauma and organised abuse, the more work that I do, the more I realise people want to do their jobs well. They want to do their jobs well. They want to feel good about the work that they do. They don't want people to slip through the cracks either. And so that's always my foundational assumption whenever I'm working with an agency or a professional. Ultimately it is about assuring people that they have something to offer in these really complex cases, and they can make a difference. What we don't want is professionals feeling overwhelmed, professionals feeling de-skilled, professionals feeling like they're not up to the task. So there is, part of my job sometimes is assuring people that they can do this, and providing information to support them to do that. Nonetheless, organised abuse and complex trauma, it does require a collaborative approach. Survivors need continuity of care across different agencies, and that can be a real challenge because the culture of a mental health service is very different to the culture of law enforcement. They speak a different language. They have different assumptions. So there needs to be some work done in terms of bridging those gaps so that, different types of agencies can work together effectively in these cases.
If we kind of shifted focus here and maybe addressed our discussion towards therapists, given this podcast, a little bit before you talked about providing evidence of child sexual abuse. Talk more about that. What did you mean by that?
Well, one of the things that we can do for therapists, especially when they come across their first case where a child or an adult might be disclosing organised abuse, or they're encountering for the first time somebody that meets the criteria for dissociative identity disorder, it can trigger a real crisis in people's practice. It can be a real shock. And so it's quite important that people have access to information about organised abuse that normalises the experience, that assures them they're not alone, that this is a recognised problem, and that they're in a position to take the skills that they already have and adapt them and apply them to a client who does have a history of severe abuse. So, of course, I don't provide clinical advice because I'm not a clinician. But what I do find is that having this discussion with therapists about organised abuse, about the patterns of abuse, the sorts of things that survivors are disclosing when they talk about organised abuse, can be really empowering for therapists and give them a lot more confidence in working with this population.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that if we can. What are some of the things that someone might disclose? And granted, things are going to be different for individuals, but can you give an example of what a therapist might hear or look for, or how they might respond, etc.?
Certainly what I've found when I'm interviewing survivors about their therapy experiences, and I've also done a lot of interview work with therapists working with this population, is that disclosure is staggered and it happens over time. So, survivors will expand on their history, sometimes over a period of a couple of years, but particularly crucial for therapists, I suppose, to hold open a space in which survivors can start to talk about experiences. Particularly, shame is something that keeps this group silent. They often feel very culpable for the abuse that's happened to them, but they've often been forced to do things to others that they feel incredibly guilty and ashamed about. And so holding open a sort of a non-judgmental listening space that invites people to elaborate on experiences that would otherwise be intolerable for them to talk about is really important. But I think, certainly paying attention to some of the dynamics around how clients are talking about abuse, particularly abuse by a parent, and then behind that experience there can be that can just be the tip of the iceberg. But if the client feels as though they've been heard in a non-judgmental way and some trust develops, then they may have a lot more to say.
Before you talked about overwhelm of the therapist, what because obviously this can be overwhelming even for certainly for a newer therapist, but what do you recommend people do to prevent overwhelm, and if they do become overwhelmed?
So, there's a range of strategies, of course, for the prevention of vicarious trauma just in the day-to-day work of psychotherapy. Of course, in terms of having adequate professional supervision, promoting your own mindfulness practice, whatever that may be. in terms of work with this group, I think reaching out for support from colleagues and other therapists who have experience working with this population, that's really important. Finding someone that can provide some clarity around these issues. And I sit on the board of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and it's so fantastic to have so many colleagues that work in an effective way with this group, but they also, have a very clear set of boundaries around how they work with this group. And that's another important point, which is boundaries. This is a client population that, by definition, is routinely in crisis. When they trust a therapist, they develop very, very strong attachments to that therapist, which then evokes a lot of difficult emotions for them. So being able to receive supervision or support from colleagues who can explain how they've managed the intensity of this kind of therapy. I think also for therapists, being very selective about where you find information about organised abuse. Reality testing is important in working with organised abuse survivors. There is a lot of information on the internet about organised abuse. Some of it is really useful, but some of it is quite conspiratorial and less useful. And when we're feeling burnt out or overwhelmed, that reality testing can be difficult. So it's important that we find ways to keep our feet on the ground so that we're grounded when we're in contact with this group, who sometimes also finds it really difficult to distinguish between what's real from what's not.
I know I've heard that there are some people who, disbelieve in this ritual abuse and so forth. And when you mention this conspiratorial information, say more about that. What is that?
Ritual abuse has been just an incredibly difficult issue in child protection and child abuse for 30 or 40 years now. And it was a form of abuse that, I think people really struggled to understand when it first emerged in the 80s and the 90s. For my direct experience, I'm not a survivor myself, but, my friend was a survivor of ritual abuse. And we had men break into the house, they painted it in blood, they left pig organs in our bed, they painted weird occult symbols on our walls, and they also, and I don't want to get too graphic about this, but I saw brands on her when they branded her with occult symbols. So, I understand why people disbelieve this sort of stuff, and I wish that I could disbelieve it as well. But I don't have the luxury of disbelief because I've witnessed this sort of activity directly myself, and I've had death threats and those sorts of things. Over the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen ritual child sexual abuse substantiated in multiple criminal prosecutions in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. There is no doubt that this is a practice that, severe pedophiles and sex offenders do engage in. I've had detailed conversations with very well-known forensic psychologists who treat child sex offenders, who have spoken to me directly about the men that they have in prison, who have disclosed engaging in this sort of activity. So this is something that happens in the world, and we do need to grapple with it. But it's a type of abuse that it seems it's very difficult for bystanders to grasp, and I think there's a tendency to either disbelieve it or to engage in a kind of a conspiratorial type of understanding, and we need to find a middle way between those two things.
How do you manage all this? I mean, how do you take care of yourself? Seriously.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I also receive supervision. So although I'm not a therapist, I see a clinical psychologist once a month, and I've done that on and off for 10 years or so. And so that just provides me with a space to sort of talk about the work. Over the course of my research, I engage in a regular meditation practice. So I meditate every day, and I also teach meditation on behalf of my local Buddhist temple. So I'm quite involved with my local Buddhist community, and I give that a lot of credit in terms of providing me with a kind of a foundation of resilience and a way of understanding so much suffering in the world, I guess, without being overwhelmed by it.
Well, I mean, I got to say, I mean, I really admire you doing this work. I mean, it's definitely, I can't think of a more fitting word. It's just so intense, and it's just so crazy. It's so beyond, like you said, what we want to think of ourselves as human beings, and yet it's not. What book recommendation would you advise? I'm going to ask for two, but specifically something you'd recommend for therapists and maybe even newer therapists, something that would really inform them around this topic.
One of my favorite books in this area was written by a fantastic trauma therapist in the States called Harvey Schwartz. And he published a book in 2013 called The Alchemy of Wolves and Sheep. And in this book, Harvey reflects on, his 30 years of experience treating survivors of, really severe complex trauma, including organized abuse, and draws direct parallels with other contemporary examples, including demobilized child soldiers. And it's a tremendously useful book. It has, a great deal of advice for therapists, but it's such a human book. I think it's very, very profound in terms of the insights that Harvey shares into the human condition, and it's a very hopeful book as well. So, he's a very important voice in this area.
Okay, so thanks for that. I've never had that recommended. So it's The Alchemy of Wolves and Sheep, a relational approach to internalized perpetration in complex trauma survivors. Harvey L. Schwartz. And again, I'll have this linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. And then a final book recommendation from you. What would you say?
Look, I'm going to recommend my book.
Well, that's going to be up there anyway. But give me something else that's whether trauma related or not. Your book's going to be up here.
Look, there was a really influential book for me from 2001 by a UK sociologist called Sarah Scott, and it's called Beyond Disbelief: The Politics of Ritual Abuse. And this was work that Sarah did in the United Kingdom. She also did interview research with survivors of ritual abuse, and she provides a really grounded analysis of their life histories and really demystifies ritual abuse. She shows how ritual abuse happens in just the everyday context of people's lives. It's not bizarre, it's not extraordinary, it's not like alien abduction. It's something that is woven into, suburban life in a very credible sort of way. And so that was published in 2001. I think it's a really important book that answers a lot, puts to bed a lot of questions around the credibility of ritual abuse. I'd really encourage people to look at it.
Okay. So once again, that's The Politics and Experience of Ritual Abuse, Sarah Scott. Also, The Alchemy of Wolves and Sheep by Harvey L. Schwartz. And Michael, your book, Organized Sexual Abuse by Michael Salter, that will be up here also on the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. What's the best way, Michael, for people to get in contact with you?
People are welcome to contact me. They can email me at michael.salter@westernsydney.edu.au. I also have a website at www.organizedabuse.com, and that's got my contact details there as well.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Again, I'm glad there are people out there like yourself who are doing this incredibly challenging and amazing work. So thank you so much for coming on the Trauma Therapist podcast.
Thank you, Guy. I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care. You know how deeply trauma impacts your client's mind, body, and emotions, and how difficult healing can be. You have clients who are constantly and unpredictably triggered by their traumatic experiences, controlled by emotions of shame, anxiety, anger, depression, and fear, and even turning to substance abuse, cutting, and other harmful behaviors to cope. World-renowned expert and author Dr. Janina Fisher's proven approach to complex trauma treatment, which is based on 40-plus years of research and clinical practice, addresses the holistic impact of trauma to effectively heal deep trauma and attachment wounds so clients can break free from the past, feel safe, calm, and thrive in life. If you're ready to become a certified complex trauma treatment professional and master neurobiologically informed treatments that will heal trauma, save marriages and families, and help clients take back their lives, then join my friends over at Pessy and save $500 today by signing up at www.pessy.com/trauma treatment. That's www.pessy, spelled PESI.com/trauma treatment. CPTSDFoundation.org provides daily recovery support, live group calls, 365 days a year. All calls are led by trauma-informed advocates, authors, and highly respected practitioners in the field of trauma recovery. CPTSDFoundation.org helps survivors connect with others who've walked through the fire of abuse and are on a path toward healing. After working with thousands of survivors all around the world, they know how to help you escape the shame of abuse by connecting with like-minded individuals so you can finally feel like healing is possible. Stop isolating between therapy appointments. Getting re-traumatized with your current strategy is no longer necessary. Reach out to CPTSD Foundation today and discover the life-changing, daily, trauma-informed peer support you've been waiting for. That's CPTSDFoundation.org.